let's talk vintage clothing. Where is it? How do I find it? How do I know it's actually vintage? Coming from a self-proclaimed vintage clothing lover, I'm constantly getting asked where I find things and how do I know if they're actually vintage. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there that will label things as vintage when they're actually not. So let's talk about it. First, keep in mind, I'm not new to this, I'm true to this. I have been buying vintage clothing since like 2013. Example pictures, way back before I even knew what I was doing, I knew I loved vintage clothes. I bought corsets, I bought shirts, I bought pants, I bought skirts, I bought dresses, all of them. I loved them. But now I'm a bit older and I'm able to more easily find what I want and actually verify that it is truly vintage. So first, let's talk in-person shopping. Obviously, we all know about thrifting at Goodwill. However, these days, Goodwill is not the top source because one, their selection sucks. And two, even if you do find something really good, chances are Goodwill has marked it up 10 times the amount that it should be. Now, personally, I prefer smaller thrift stores. So if you've got like a St. Vincent's or a Mother Teresa's or God knows what kind of local thrift store you have in your town, just make sure it's not a big corporate business like Goodwill. That is the first place I would look in person. And personally, based on my style, I always pinpoint certain sections first. I always go to the dresses and I always go to the lingerie because I wear slip dresses a lot and slip dresses tend to get stuck in with the lingerie, right? I also love looking at flea markets and antique stores. Now, I do find that I typically don't get actual clothing from those places, but I do like to source like vintage purses and vintage hats as well. If you can find an estate sale in your town as well, highly recommend. Usually a jackpot if you can get there and there's not a bunch of scalpers already there to beat you to the clothes. And if we're talking not in person, there's so many websites online where you can find vintage clothing being resold. Sometimes it is being sold for very high prices, and the more vintage clothing that you'll buy, the more you'll find that it's certain pieces, certain styles, certain brands that tend to go for more. And that's typically because they're good quality and in high demand and hard to find because they're not being made anymore. Some of the online sites that I personally prefer are Depop, Etsy, and eBay. Now there are other ones like Poshmark and Mercari, whatever. I think Vinted is a lot more popular outside of the US. I personally have never used it, but I have heard a lot of people have success with it. And a lot of these sites allow you to make offers. So if a price maybe is a little bit out of your range, you can always make an offer to the seller to see if they will go lower. That doesn't mean lowball them. I did not say that, and I do not recommend lowballing. Let's have some common sense. So we found a piece. How do we know if it's actually vintage? Now, in this context, vintage is technically 20 years or older. I know we don't want to hear that vintage is in the 2000s, but that's where we're at, okay? We can't always live in denial. So technically, vintage would be considered anything from 2005 and older. Now, the easiest way to find out if something is vintage is by the tag, and there's actually quite a few signs on a tag that can tell you if they're vintage. If you're super lucky, the most obvious one is that the brand actually put the date that they made this item on the tag. This isn't super common, but it does happen. Now, some brands like Victoria's Secret are very well known for putting dates on their labels. Not their super old stuff, at least in my experience, but if we're talking like 2000s, 90s, they definitely put the date on the label, and I'll show you an example here. This one was made in September of 2003. That's vintage, argue with your mom, not me. Whereas this item from Victoria's Secret was made in September of 2024. Or this one that was made in October of 1994. Obviously having the date on it makes it a million times easier, but we're not always gonna get that lucky every time. So what else can we look out for? Glad you asked. There is a certain look to vintage tags that you can usually tell at least that they're vintage, even if you don't know exactly what decade they're from. And if you're interested, we can talk more in detail about sourcing what decade they're from at a later time. But one of the telltale signs is a big, bold brand. Look at that, Patra, huge. This one, Jean Veron, big, bold brand name. Typically modern tags tend to have a smaller print. Not all of them. I mean, we've seen what Killstar tags look like, right? But they tend to have a smaller, neater print instead of this big, bold, like font choice that sticks out. And another example, just big, bold, fancy kind of print. Doesn't look modern, doesn't look minimalist, it stands out. If you can't tell by the brand name on the tag, another surefire way to know it's vintage is if it has a Union tag. This one's kind of hard to see because it's old, but this is a Union stamp. Ladies Garment Workers Union. Vintage every time. Another good sign is made in the USA. Now, are all vintage clothing made in the United States? No, but it is a lot more likely that something that is made in the USA is vintage. You see a lot less clothing made in the United States these days. Now, what if there's no brand tag, but there's a size tag? Sizing can be a dead giveaway as well, because vintage sizing, again, depending on the decade, could run a lot different than modern sizing. And I'm gonna give you examples of that as well. These vintage jeans, size 6 medium, the waist size, 24 inches, which would be about a modern day 0, 1. I think it's a 0 because a 1 is 25 inches. On that note, I don't even know if you're gonna be able to read this, it's so faint. But this is a size 9. The waist, 25 inches. These are not modern day sizes. It is very easy to know that these are vintage sizes, which can vary. That's also why it's super important if you're buying online to make sure that you have a good idea of the measurements of the item. Otherwise, it might not fit like you expect. Now, what if it doesn't have a brand or size tag at all? How do you know it's vintage? Now, you can't always guarantee everything, but sometimes you can look out for things like the silhouette of the item. Like if you find something with shoulder pads, we can almost guarantee it's vintage, right? Sometimes the styles themselves, especially when you're so used to this and you're in there, you can just tell that an item does not look like a modern trendy item that you would see. But you can also go based off of the material, because vintage items tend to use a lot of the same materials. You'll see a lot of nylon, 100% rayon, acrylic, hell, even a lot of polyester, which I know you can also see a lot of these days, but still, these are just things that you can look out for on the items to give you a good hint of if it's true vintage. Hopefully these tips are at least a little bit helpful for the next time you go out looking for vintage clothing, because in my opinion, vintage clothing holds up way better than modern clothing. And I say that as someone who has items all the way from the 1930s to today. Why are my 1930s items in better condition than the items I got last year? Riddle me that, Batman.